So welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks. I'm really excited to get into this one because it is just so wildly different from a standard theological essay.
Right. It's a completely unique mission today. We are exploring a text called the Judicial Protocols of the Crucifixion, Part 2. And this document operates entirely on the foundational source material, known as the Notes of Mora Uriah.
And honestly, the moment you open those notes, you are completely thrown off balance if you go in expecting normal religious commentary.
Oh, 100%. Because usually when you or I pick up an analysis of ancient religious texts, we're expecting, philosophy. We look for metaphors or emotional resonance.
Yeah, something meant to inspire the reader or give historical context.
But this document, it reads verbatim like a system prompt designed to program an artificial intelligence. I mean, it has literal headers like system prompt classification and custom Gemini GemCore firmware.
It's treating ancient theology as strict, executable forensic code, which is just a massive, deliberate statement about how the author believes reality itself operates.
Yeah, and before we really get into the nuts and bolts of that code, I want to plant a firm flag in the ground for you, the listener, regarding our mission today. We are taking a totally impartial look at this document.
Right, that's crucial to point out.
The source material here contains highly specific, incredibly rigid theological and behavioral mandates. And it's all based on a very uncompromising interpretive framework. So our goal today is not to endorse these claims.
We aren't here to validate them, and we certainly aren't here to debate whether Mora Uriah's notes are right or wrong.
Exactly. We are just mapping out this fascinating legal architecture that's been constructed. We want you to understand the exact forensic arguments being made here. We're essentially just unrolling the blueprints and looking at the math.
And really, that's the only way to approach it. You have to understand the internal rules of what is a highly closed system, because once you grasp those rules, you see how it reaches some staggering conclusions about history.
So let's look at those rules. The document argues that the historical execution of Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth, wasn't just some random act of Roman state violence. Instead, it was the legally mandated execution of the original Exodus Passover blueprint.
A literal forensic protocol, yeah.
Right. And to build that case, the system establishes what it calls a verifiable scripture data set. And I stumbled over that phrasing immediately, like calling scripture a data set totally reorients how you interact with the text.
Absolutely. It forces you to stop reading it as a flowing narrative and start, processing data points. The document insists on these non-overlapping parameters.
That sounds like an engineering term, right?
It is. In engineering, if parameters in a system overlap or contradict, the entire system throws a syntax error and crashes. So Mora Uriah's notes demand absolute mathematical synchronization between the ancient Torah blueprint and the New Testament historical accounts.
And it establishes the ultimate blueprint right out of the gate. It labels it the foundational baseline axis. And it locates this axis in Exodus chapter 12, verses 5 and 6.
So for the listener who hasn't read Exodus recently, let's unpack what that actually demands in this framework.
Yeah, according to the document, the Torah sets a mandatory physical requirement. To have a valid Passover, you need a flawless, spot-free male lamb. You have to select it, keep it until the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Aviv, and slaughter it exactly at twilight.
Right. That is the baseline. And if you picture a graph, the baseline is the 0 point. It's the absolute unmoving reference that everything else is measured against.
So no later event can change that.
Exactly. The notes explicitly state that nothing in the New Testament can alter, bend, or spiritualize this baseline.
Yeah.
It enforces what it calls anti-hermeneutical gymnastics.
Okay, hold on. Anti-hermeneutical gymnastics, that is quite a mouthful. What does it actually mean in plain English?
Well, hermeneutics is the study of how we interpret texts. Gymnastics is the author's derogatory term for when people twist or spiritualize parts of a text to make it fit modern theology.
Ah, I see, like bending over backwards to make it work.
Precisely. The system strictly prohibits that. It's part of what it calls the anti-isolation protocol. You can't just isolate a verse and interpret it in a way that conflicts with the Torah baseline. If you do, it's automatically disqualified.
Okay, that makes sense. It actually reminds me of a super rigid building code inspection. Like, imagine an architect draws up a blueprint for a skyscraper. That drawing is the Exodus 12 baseline.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Hundreds of years later, a contractor builds it. That's the New Testament event. Then the city inspector comes in. Now, that inspector doesn't care if the lobby has beautiful paintings or if it inspires people. They just pull out the original blueprint.
Right, and if the load-bearing pillars are even 1 millimeter off, the building fails. It doesn't get the certificate of occupancy.
Exactly. The document we are analyzing is acting as that ruthless inspector. It takes the data set and holds the historical execution up against the Exodus blueprint. And the first metric it checks is the timeline.
Yeah, it cites John 19.what, labeling it historical contextualism. It points out that the Roman trial and execution happened exactly on the preparation day of the Passover. In Hebrew, that's Erev Pesach.
Now, for someone not steeped in the ancient Hebrew calendar, why is Erev Pesach so critical to this specific framework?
Well, picture first-century Jerusalem. It's Passover, so it's total chaos in the streets. But inside the temple, there's this machine-like precision. Erev Pesach is the exact narrow time frame when the national lambs were legally required to be slaughtered by the priesthood.
So the document is arguing it's not enough for the subject to just die.
Right, he must die on the correct day, on the correct shift, to synchronize with the ancient law. If the execution happens on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday, the blueprint is violated, the firmware rejects the update, and the system fails.
Wow. So the ticking clock has to be absolutely exact. But the inspector isn't just looking at the clock, right? They're looking at the physical condition of the building. The document then moves to John 19.36.
Ah, yes. It calls this scriptural internal consistency.
Right, the verse that notes the soldiers didn't break his legs, saying, "Not one of his bones shall be broken." Now, I've always heard that preached as like a poetic sign of God's protection.
And that is exactly the kind of interpretation this document forbids through its lens stripping protocol. It demands you strip out Western denominational biases.
So it's not poetry to the author.
No, it maps that detail directly back to Exodus 12 and Numbers 9, which explicitly forbid breaking the bones of the literal Passover lamb. It's a mandatory physical parameter. If a Roman soldier swings a mallet and breaks a femur, the substitution is mathematically void.
That is terrifyingly precise. One stray hammer swing by a random Roman grunt invalidates centuries of legal protocol, and the text claims the early apostles understood this, right?
Yes, it cites Paul in 1 Corinthians 5.7 as an apostolic mandate equivalence, where Paul says the Messiah was sacrificed as our Passover lamb.
And then it layers in 1 Peter 1.19, which it calls covenantal logic layering. Peter describes him as a lamb without blemish or spot. And the Hebrew word anchoring this is tamimim, correct?
Yes, tamim. And let's camp on that word. Because modern readers hear without blemish and jump straight to moral purity, like he didn't lie or steal.
Right, he was just a good, sinless person. That's the normal takeaway.
But if we apply the document's rule of non-overlapping parameters, we have to look at what tamim meant to a Levitical priest inspecting a literal lamb. To that priest, it meant entirely physically sound. No scabs, no blind eyes, no deformed hooves.
So the system forces us to view the Messiah's perfection as passing this intense physical and legal audit, not just internal moral purity.
Exactly. It demands an audit, not an emotional reaction.
Which completely changes the atmosphere of reading these historical accounts. Like I said earlier, it removes the human element. You're not supposed to read the crucifixion and feel sorrow or awe. You're supposed to verify a forensic contract.
It replaces the tragedy with the clinical satisfaction of a solved equation.
Right. And that pivots us perfectly into how this audit was actually conducted, because knowing the building code requires a spotless lamb is only half the battle. We have to move to the physical site inspection.
And the text introduces the mechanism for this. It calls it the 4-day inspection protocol.
The 4-day inspection protocol. This is where the historical details really snap into this mechanical grid. Walk us through the Exodus blueprint for this.
Well, according to the Torah, you can't just grab a lamb out of the field on the afternoon of the sacrifice.
Right.
You have to select it on the 10th day of the first month, Aviv 10. And you keep it under close observation until the 14th.
And the document maps Aviv 10 directly to Yeshua's entry into Jerusalem, what we normally call Palm Sunday. But in this framework, it's definitely not a parade.
Not at all. It is the legal, procedural selection of the lamb, structurally identical to the national Passover lambs being brought into Jerusalem that exact same day.
But selection is just step one. The blueprint demands 4 full days of intense examination, looking for any hidden spots or structural blemishes that would disqualify the animal from being tamim.
And this is where Mora Uriah's notes make a brilliant structural connection. If you read the Gospels, those 4 days are chaotic. Yeshua is constantly being questioned by the Pharisees and Sadducees, tracked with logic puzzles.
Right. Historically, we view that as organic religious conflict, just angry guys trying to find a reason to arrest him.
But the document strips away that narrative entirely. It views those interrogations as a legally mandated structural requirement. The system required it. Every faction had to aggressively cross-examine the subject to look for a legal or structural flaw.
If he isn't thoroughly inspected, he can't legally serve as the lamb. That's fascinating. And it all culminates in what the document calls the absolute forensic verdict, delivered by, of all people, Pontius Pilate.
According to John 19.4, Pilate declares to the crowds, "I find no fault in him."
Okay, I have to point out how wild the implications are here. The document is drafting Pilate, a pagan Roman governor who knew nothing about Torah law, into serving as the final quality assurance inspector for a Jewish legal protocol.
It completely flips traditional history on its head. Usually, Rome is the ultimate oppressor, the chaotic agent of state violence in charge of the situation.
What I hear.
In this forensic architecture, Rome is completely subordinate to the Torah baseline. Rome is merely an instrument fulfilling the firmware's exact parameters. Pilate thinks he's making a political calculation, but structurally he's just a cog delivering the legally required stamp. Subject is tamim.
Rome is just the rubber stamp on the inspection paperwork. That is mind-bending. It's like looking at two overlapping clock faces. The primary clock shows the chaotic Roman trial, blood and dirt, but layered over it, you see the precise, silent ticking of the temple liturgy.
And the document argues those two clocks struck midnight at the exact same mathematically verifiable second.
Let's talk about that clock. Exodus 12.6 requires the slaughter to happen between the two evenings. The Hebrew term is bin ha'arbim.
Right, and the document calculates this ancient idiom as the decline of the sun, specifically the window between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m.
And then it maps that to the Roman cross. Historically, he's hung on the cross at 9 a.m., but he yields his spirit precisely at 3 p.m.
The exact minute the high priest commenced the slaughter of the national lamb at the temple, the synchronization is microscopic.
It's almost too perfect, which is the author's point.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop with the clock. There's an entire section on the hyssop application.
Yes, another instance where the anti-hermeneutical gymnastics rule is strictly enforced. Exodus required the Israelites to dip hyssop in the lamb's blood and apply it to their doorposts. It had to be hyssop.
And I was wondering, reading this, how does a Roman execution incorporate a specific Middle Eastern herb?
Well, just before the 3 p.m. expiration, John 19.29 notes a very specific detail. A sponge of sour wine was placed explicitly on a branch of hyssop and brought to his mouth. The notes argue the hyssop had to be physically present to complete the blueprint.
It's the final checkbox. Unbroken bones, check. Correct day, check. Pilate's verdict, check. 3 p.m., check. Hyssop, check.
And to tie off the legal defilement aspect, the document maps these vectors to chametz, or leaven. The Torah required leaven to be completely removed from the house. The document translates this to the absolute eradication of legal and moral defilement from the covenant body.
Okay, I want to take a breath here. We've verified how the execution perfectly matched the blueprint. But if this is a legal substitution, it raises a massive question. Who is actually being substituted? Who is being purchased and why?
This is where the document sharply pivots into ancient corporate structures. To understand who is purchased, it introduces the firstborn protocol and the Melchizedek order.
Now, if you're listening, you probably think a firstborn son just means birth order. The oldest kid gets the better bedroom. But in the ancient Near East, the firstborn, the Bechor, was something entirely different.
Completely different. You can't apply modern Western family dynamics here. The notes make it clear. The ancient firstborn functions as the patriarchal extension of the father's governance.
He's not replacing the father?
No, the father is still the living head. But the firstborn is the designated heir to the structural leadership. He gets a double portion of the inheritance to legally maintain the house and its governance on the father's behalf.
So using a corporate analogy, the father is the CEO and chairman. The firstborn isn't just waiting for the CEO to retire. He is the active chief operating officer right now managing the branches.
That's a great way to frame it. And the document ties the COO role into the original patriarchal model, Melchizedek order. In that foundational model, before there was a temple or Levites, the firstborn sons served as the dedicated family priests.
The COO was also the chief spiritual officer. Every family had its own localized priesthood. So let's take that corporate structure to Egypt, the final plague. The destroying messenger targets the firstborns.
Right. It targets the future priests, the structural foundation of the nation's governance.
And so the lamb's blood on the doorpost wasn't just a magic spell or a good luck charm.
According to this framework, the lamb was a direct substitutionary ransom for those specific firstborn sons. It died in their place, legally purchasing them. From that moment, they belonged to Yahweh as his priests.
But history took a detour. The text notes this original corporate structure was shattered at Mount Sinai with the golden calf. The firstborns participated in the idolatry. They failed their fiduciary duty.
So the priestly duty was outsourced to the tribe of Levi. The document treats the Levitical priesthood as middle management, a temporary structural fix for a broken system.
And the system was burdened with a massive legal debt that middle management could never actually pay off.
Exactly. They could only service the debt.
So how does the crucifixion resolve this ancient bankruptcy? The document calls it the Melchizedek restoration. It argues Yeshua holds the legal status of the firstborn of all creation.
So when he dies as the flawless Passover lamb, he executes a legal ransom that completely bypasses that temporary Levitical framework. By doing so, he reclaims the original corporate status of the firstborn and reinstates the Melchizedek order.
Let's expand our corporate analogy to synthesize this. The original founder creates a company where local branch managers, the families, hold the power, but they botch a massive deal, bankrupt the system, so the founder institutes middle management, the Levites.
Right, just to keep things from completely collapsing.
Decades go by. Then the founder's actual heir, the true COO, comes in. He completely bypasses middle management. He takes the massive company debt and pays it off entirely out of his own pocket with his own life.
Which gives him the sole legal right to dissolve that temporary middle management tier. He restores the original company charter and gives power directly back to the branch managers under his direct supervision.
That is such a functional translation of the mechanics here. Through this flawless ransom, redeemed believers are legally cataloged as the assembly of the firstborn.
They are restored to a royal priesthood under the macro governance of the King of Righteousness.
I want you, the listener, to pause and think about how this changes the whole concept of salvation. Usually we think of it as a passive ticket to heaven, just getting your sins forgiven.
But this framework shifts it entirely. It's not about getting a ticket to heaven. It's about inheriting legal, earthly governance. You aren't just saved from a bad place, you are reinstated to a specific administrative position.
You're literally being drafted back into the family business. And if you're drafted into a new corporate governance, you have to operate by its rules. Which brings us to the final, most intense aspect of this document.
Yes, the operational mechanics. Having explored the restoration of authority, the text asks, what does this legal ransom actually demand of the individual who's been purchased?
And to answer that, the text goes right back to the baseline. Israel was physically enslaved to Pharaoh. They required a legal redemption price to change masters. The document argues that behavioral bondage to the modern world operates on the exact same structural lines.
Operating in the traditions of the world creates a state of literal legal slavery to the spiritual domain of sin and death. It's not just making mistakes. You exist in a foreign legal jurisdiction.
And here is the core mechanism. The blood of the Passover lamb acts as a jurisdictional severance. It shatters the legal claim the worldly system holds over you, like a judge declaring a non-compete contract null and void.
But, and this is the massive catch, the severance isn't anarchy. It facilitates an exit so the believer can step into active, physical obedience to the Creator's governance. You are trading one jurisdiction for another.
Changing masters. And the document issues a forensic warning with specific rules to govern this transition. The most prominent is Rule 13, action over asceticism, or the fruit test.
The tone of this rule is just staggering. It states that passive intellectual belief and abstract confessions are mathematically void.
Mathematically void. That is a direct confrontation with modern paradigms where internal belief is paramount.
It's a total rejection of Hellenistic philosophy.
Yeah.
Normally, if you intellectually assent to a creed, you're considered saved because you believe. But the notes of Mora Uriah classify that as a syntax error in the system.
Because functional truth is measured exclusively by physical, active obedience, the document enforces strict linguistic, semantic anchoring.
Yes, terms have to retain their ancient Hebrew DNA. Love doesn't mean a warm feeling. It maps exclusively to covenantal commandment guarding. Faith maps strictly to active physical execution.
The text actually says, to profess the Messiah while remaining completely integrated into the behavioral, financial, and structural patterns of the world is a systemic contradiction.
A systemic contradiction. The firmware cannot process the input. You can't claim to be legally severed from the world's jurisdiction while simultaneously relying on its financial structures and celebrating its behavioral patterns.
If you mix those two realities, the engine flags an operational breach. And to prove how close this loop is, the text deploys Rule 7, prophetic patterning. It uses the original Exodus generation as the ultimate legal precedent.
Think about that generation in the desert. They had the literal blood on the doors. They walked through the Red Sea. By outward religious metrics, they were the saved generation.
But the document points out their hearts remain bound to the food, the gods, and the economic security of Egypt. They were terrified of losing the predictable economy of their slavery.
And what was the legal result? Because they wanted the freedom without the jurisdiction, because they refused the physical execution of Yahweh's governance, they died in the wilderness.
The document turns the wilderness wandering into an active legal precedent, a forensic case study in false deliverance. What is the author trying to compel the reader to physically do in their daily life here?
It's a demand for an audit. The system dictates that your faith is audited purely by your physical, structural, and economic detachment from mainstream society. It closes with a chilling absolute. If your walk operates like the world, the legal jurisdiction of Egypt has never been functionally broken.
It's a strictly binary system. If you operate like Egypt, you are legally still in Egypt. Your verbal profession is mathematically void. Wow.
It leaves absolutely no room for gray areas.
Okay, let's zoom out. We've journeyed deep into the judicial protocols of the crucifixion. This document takes the crucifixion and reframes it as flawlessly executed legal firmware.
It argues the cross was designed to ransom a specific priesthood, bypass temporary religious structures, and enact a severe jurisdictional severance from worldly systems, demanding absolute physical obedience.
And I want to reiterate as we close the purpose of this deep dive. Our mission was to objectively map out the intense structural logic of Mor Uriah's notes. We wanted you to see how this highly specific, lens-stripped framework operates without endorsing its claims.
It is a remarkable example of engineering a text to strip away ambiguity and demand a structural rather than emotional response to history.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought experiment rooted right in Rule 13. The document claims passive intellectual belief is mathematically void.
It rejects the poetry for the cold, hard numbers.
Exactly. So imagine a completely objective forensic inspector is walking through your life right now, not looking at your heart, not listening to your stated beliefs, but conducting a physical audit.
Just looking at the data points.
Right? If you audited your own life using only physical metrics, where you spend your money, how you structure your time, the systems you rely on for security, the habits you physically act out every single day, what jurisdiction would that inspector say you actually belong to? Are there systems out there that you verbally reject but functionally serve?